Welcome back again, everyone. So happy to have you all here. Uh, right. So, our first speaker today is Zoe Lister, who's going to speak to us about Cassandra, Trauma Through the Eyes of Myth. Zoe is in the final year of her bachelor's degree in classical studies at the Open University. And when she signed up on impulse, she did not even know that classics was a subject. She has contributed to the Working Classicists book, A Periodic Table of Greek Mythology, writing the section on Cassandra. Having started ancient Greek with the specific goal of translating Sappho, Zoe previously took first place in the HM Classics Academy Festival with her translation of Fragment 31. She has also been regularly contributing to the HM Classics Academy blog with pieces on Greek mythology, currently looking specifically at the women of the Trojan War. And having experienced complications from surgery resulting in PTSD, she has found value in exploring mythology for similar experiences and has been inspired to research this further to bring attention to the experiences of women in both ancient and modern times. Take
Hello,
it away.
everyone. Thanks for the introduction. Let me see if I share this correctly. There we go. Can everyone see that? Yeah,
Yep.
perfect. Okay, let me just double check it works. There we go. Yeah. So I've got my little script on my iPad, so if I'm not looking at the camera, please excuse me. So I'm looking at the representation of trauma and things that we would now term post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in women of Greek mythology. I'd noticed that while there seems to be a lot of information out there on the effects of trauma on male characters, such as Ajax the Greater, who went mad with rage and he killed the sheep or cattle, thinking that they were the Achaean leaders, according to Sophocles, and then he kills himself out of shame. Uh, there seems to be much less on women's response to trauma. While women may not have been expected to fight in wars as the men were, they were nonetheless affected by war. They would have faced their own deaths, the deaths of their loved ones, loss of their homes, and would have been subjected to sexual violence, trafficking, and slavery. Um, the ancients were also aware of the psychological effects of warfare, with Gorgias writing in about this in his Encomium of Helen and encouraged what could be considered an early form of talking therapy to process trauma. And then there was Aeschylus, who understood the power of words to heal, writing in Prometheus Bound, words are physicians for a sick soul. And considering Aristotle also considered tragedy to be important to returning soldiers coping with their fear through catharsis and pity, it could be that this kind of group re-experiencing of trauma allowed for the men to know that they were not alone in their struggles and that their community understood, and this eased their distress. I feel it's important to be clear that this talk is in no way an attempt to diagnose anyone with anything. Even a qualified medical professional wouldn't diagnose someone they haven't met. I'm not a qualified medical professional, and the characters I discuss may well have not even existed. But it's not historical fact that matters in mythology. It's the lesson that the story conveys. What I'm trying to present here is an undeniable fact. It's my own interaction with the texts and how I relate to them through my own experience. There are as many interpretations of the texts as there are people who read them. So the reason I was drawn to this subject was my own experience of PTSD. After experiencing a spinal cord injury and complications from surgeries resulting in an infection that nearly killed me, I began suffering from flashbacks and other symptoms of PTSD. Thankfully, mental health is much less taboo, and because we were more able to talk about these things, I was able to spot what was happening and get help for that. The idea to look into possible examples of the condition in mythology came to me when I was reading Aeschylus's Agamemnon. The visions and outbursts that Cassandra has seem very familiar to me, and so I decided to look further into this using Cassandra as a starting point. So I think the first thing that we need to do is look at what PTSD actually is, as defined by our own present day medical institutions. The NHS, DSM, and ICD all say that PTSD can be caused by experiencing a traumatic event, either first or second hand. So it either happens to you or you witness something happening to someone else. Um, Examples of such traumatic events could be violent personal assault, including sexual assault, death of someone else, war and conflict, sex trafficking, or slavery. And that list's far from comprehensive, as it's impossible to list everything, but these are just the ones that I feel are more relevant to Cassandra as a case study. I think it's fair to say that by the time she reached Mycenae, she had suffered all of these things, far more than any person should ever have to. Some of the symptoms, among many others, that someone experiencing PTSD may suffer from could be nightmares, flashbacks, feelings of isolation, irritability, and guilt. As we work through the source material itself, I'll highlight how Cassandra's dialogue could indicate that she was experiencing some of these symptoms. So the next thing to look at is who Cassandra was. I'm sure many of us are familiar with this character, especially if you've spent more than 5 seconds in a room with me, because I never shut up about her. Cassandra was a Trojan princess. She was the daughter of the king and queen, Priam and Hecuba. She had prophetic powers, as did her twin brother Helenus. There are a couple of versions of how she got her prophetic powers. One version says that her parents left both her and her brother in the temple of Apollo overnight, and when they returned the next day to collect them, they found snakes licking their children's ears. And snakes are often associated with prophecy. Another version is that while Cassandra was serving as a priestess in the temple of Apollo, the god was attracted to her and told her that if she slept with him, he would give her the gift of prophecy. While Cassandra initially agreed, she then withdrew her consent. Apollo, angered by this but unable to take his gift away, cursed her to never be believed. Cassandra predicted that Paris bringing Helen to Troy would cause the destruction of the city, and later that the wooden horse would be full of Greek soldiers. Both times she was right, but no one believed her. During the fall of Troy, she took sanctuary in the temple of Athena, and she clung to the statue of Athena, seeking protection from the goddess. Ajax the Lesser dragged Cassandra from the statue, knocking it over in the process, and raped her. Having committed sacrilege by defiling both the temple and Cassandra, Poseidon and Athena ensured the death of Ajax on his journey home. Following the fall of Troy, Cassandra was taken by Agamemnon as part of his share of the spoils of war. As she arrives in Mycenae with Agamemnon, she predicts that both of them will be murdered, another prophecy proven true when Agamemnon's wife Clytemnestra, or a lover Aegisthus in some versions, kills both of them. So, as I've mentioned already, the first text that got me thinking about all of this was Aeschylus' Agamemnon. It's been one of my favourite tragedies ever since I started studying classics, but it was after my own diagnosis that I was reading it and felt that Cassandra's responses to a situation were suddenly a lot more understandable to me. I'm going to be using Ted Hughes' translation for this. I realise not everyone will be familiar with the play, so I'll sum it up to the point that would make Cassandra herself. The play starts with the watchman, sat atop a tower, basically bored out of his mind. He's watching for a fire being lit that would signal the end of the Trojan War and that the king, Agamemnon, was on his way home. He seems almost on the verge of quitting. Agamemnon's been gone for 10 years and there's no sign of his return. And then suddenly he sees a dot of light in the distance. He can't believe it. The signal fire's been lit. He rushes to inform the queen, Clytemnestra. Now, Clytemnestra is buzzing, but not in a good way. When Agamemnon left for war, the wind was not blowing in the right direction, and Calchas the prophet said that a sacrifice was needed to ensure a favourable wind. But not just any sacrifice, a human sacrifice. Agamemnon told his wife Clytemnestra to bring their daughter Iphigenia, saying that she would be married to the hero Achilles. However, when their daughter arrived, it became clear that she was not a bride, she was the sacrificial victim. Clytemnestra spent the last 10 years scheming and plotting her revenge, and she will finally get the chance to get her own back and punish Agamemnon for his actions. She says the dead will have many an opportunity to avenge themselves in full on those who have angered the gods. When Agamemnon arrives, Clytemnestra's flattering him, appearing to be delighted that he's home. She's full of praise for him and has arranged for a massively expensive purple carpet to be laid out for him to walk on. To his credit, Agamemnon is uncomfortable with this. He's wary that this treatment is only for the gods, not men, and fears punishment should he accept. He rejects Clytemnestra's welcome at first. However, after a back and forth with Clytemnestra saying, look, you've had so many victories in so many things, will you just let me win this one? He relents and walks up the carpet into his palace. As he leaves the stage, he basically says, oh, by the way, this is Cassandra. She's going to be our slave. Can you look after her? And while Agamemnon's introduction of Cassandra seems almost like an offhand and unimportant comment as he exits the stage, Cassandra herself is vital to driving the action of the play. After all, the murder couldn't be shown on stage, so someone had to tell what was going on. Our first introduction to her shows someone mute and unresponsive, seemingly unaware of her surroundings, completely ignoring Clytemnestra's instructions to come inside. Clytemnestra herself realizes that something isn't right with her. After all, she's always displayed as the perfect example of my favorite Greek word, dene, which is fearful and terrible, but also awe-inspiring, clever, and imbued with a strange power, especially when being used to describe a woman. Clytemnestra says, is the girl crazed with shock or grief, or is she an idiot? Or is she locked up in some twittering language like a strange bird brought in a cage? This shows that there was understanding that terrible and traumatic experiences could have an effect on a person, making them unable to interact with the world. To me, this symbolizes two parts of PTSD, both the dissociation that can be experienced during flashbacks and the difficulty in connecting with others. A flashback takes you out of the present time. It's more than just a memory, it's a total re-experiencing of the trauma. Every sense is involved. For me, I could smell the disinfectant of the hospital ward. I could hear all of the noises and clashing about that you would expect in a busy medical setting. It's hard to engage with current senses when those from the past have taken over. As for the difficulty with communicating, after a traumatic experience, nothing makes sense. You have to adjust to a whole new life. And even if you understand perfectly what someone is saying to you, it can feel impossible to respond or follow instructions. Like the experience puts up this invisible barrier between you and the rest of the world. Despite the chorus trying to encourage Cassandra to follow instructions, she can't, and Clytemnestra eventually gives up, leaving her with the chorus. As she leaves, she says, she's mad, I think. Her head's tangled and wrapped in her madness. Her brains are like her father's city, ruins and smoking embers, and the stink of corpses. For me, this further backs up what Cassandra is experiencing here as some kind of flashback. Other people can see that she's completely engulfed by tragedy and unable to come out of it. The mention of the sensory experiences and the fact that Cassandra is so tangled in them and unable to escape. This is what flashbacks feel like to me. Like being caught up in a barbed wire, unable to escape the sights, sounds, and smells, because no matter how hard you try, every movement causes more pain. The chorus then show pity to Cassandra, telling her she needs to accept this out of necessity. There's no other way for her. And after this, we see Cassandra return to the present, and she is terrified. Another part of PTSD is emotional instability, which can include outbursts of anger. Cassandra here screams to and at Apollo, despite the chorus warning her not to do this. They accuse her of blasphemy, saying, you cannot defile the name of Apollo with the voice of such agony. He hates cries that surrender to anguish and despair. Of course, Cassandra would have known this. She was a priestess of Apollo, and also the recipient of his wrath, having not followed his demands. To me, this shows the strength of what she's feeling and the uncontrollable nature of her emotions. And although she looks to Apollo for guidance, she also seems to seek to partly blame him for what is happening, saying, Apollo, God of my guidance, you led me the whole long way only to destroy me. Reflecting that while she may have seen Apollo as a protector, she may also be coming to realize that her sorrows were at least in part caused by him. Reactions to trauma can be complex. I know I was furious with my surgeon at first. I blamed him for causing the damage. But over time, I realised that he had been given an impossible task, and there was no way of stopping what happened. But it did prevent worse from happening. The complicated nature of trauma means that any kind of interaction or relationship can be turned on its head multiple times. The next part of the play shows Cassandra's reaction to realising where she is. She recognises that she's in the place where multiple crimes were committed against both humans and the gods. House of Atreus, to which both Agamemnon and his brother Menelaus belonged, had a history of basically unpleasant acts. Tantalus tried to trick the gods into eating his son, Pelops, with Demeter, distracted by her missing daughter, actually eating his shoulder. Pelops' entire line being cursed by Myrtilus as he killed him. And there's multiple versions of exactly why Pelops killed him, but either way, it was after Myrtilus had sabotaged the chariot of King Oinomaus. I always struggle with that one. So Pelops could win a race. Then there's Atreus and Thyestes, who had a lot of issues, including Atreus killing and cooking Thyestes' sons and feeding them to him, and then waving the children's hands and feet before Thyestes as a taunt. Thyestes, banished for human flesh, for eating human flesh, asked an oracle what to do, and was told to have a son by his daughter. Did this, the son being Aegisthus, who later killed his father/grandfather and eventually became involved with Clytemnestra and the murder of Agamemnon. Cassandra can see all of this history in front of her, saying, a house that hates God, a house that God hates, walls weeping blood, housing butchered innocents, and the blood and bones of the children. And running in blood, look, look, the witnesses. Children covering their eyes, sobbing blood through their fingers, children chopped up, screaming, and roasted and eaten by their own father. Well, obviously, this is referring to the crimes committed by the House of Atreus. Part of me wonders if what she sees forms at least part of a flashback. As Troy fell, innocents were slaughtered, women and children both, those that were not valuable enough to be taken as slaves. The fires set by the Greek soldiers, roasting people alive, and the children screaming in fear, victims of the war their fathers were fighting. While I think the evidence of this being a flashback is much more shaky, I feel it could be interpreted as a callback to Cassandra's experiences in Troy, as well as recounting the crimes committed by the family of the man who was taken her captive. An important aspect of mythology is time. The stories took place in the past, but also the present and the future. It doesn't fit into our view of time as a linear thing. It's more like the past and the present happen simultaneously. So here, Cassandra could be viewing the past trauma of the location she finds herself in through the window of her own experiences. Ritual reenactments of mythological stories were part of the ancient Greek religious practice, and these practices would have collapsed time upon itself, using the past as a way to understand the present. This is similar to what I'm doing here, using something from the past to understand my own present, knowing that everything I have experienced has already been experienced, and in doing this, the ancient past ties itself into my present. Cassandra then begins to tell the murder of Agamemnon, possibly in the most death metal passage of any play I've ever read. She tells the story in great detail. Clytemnestra trapping Agamemnon in the bath with a net and driving some kind of bronze object through him. I like to think of it was a Labrador axe just because they look cool, and also would have been used in ancient Greece. However, Cassandra then says something that felt like it punched me in the stomach when I read it. The Furies crowd into the house, gorged with the blood of this house. Ravenous for the blood of this house. Look at the Furies. Look, look. This to me is the absolute pinnacle of Cassandra's panic, and the reason it hit me is that PTSD feels like being chased by the Furies. Terrifying creatures that hunt down those that have committed the worst crimes, such as killing one's family. When the Furies are chasing you, you know about it. Later, Orestes, Agamemnon and Clytemnestra's son, will be chased by them after killing his mother. With PTSD, you become hyper-aware. Everything becomes a threat. You're forever on edge, waiting for the next catastrophe. You could almost hear the Furies gnashing their teeth, waiting to destroy you. The Furies embody this hyper-arousal, and Cassandra can see them when no one else can. Chorus don't understand what she's saying. They don't think Agamemnon is getting murdered as they speak. They don't see the threat. But Cassandra, she's aware of every single threat in that city, and she knows that she's next. She tells of her own murder next, and this is the point that the intensity of her panic decreases. She recalls her childhood growing up by the river Scamander and laments the destruction of her home. She regrets that her prophecies were not believed. She defends her prophecies to the chorus, who will soon realize that she was right. She then abandons the garb of a priestess, removing her robe and garlands, forsaking Apollo. Her acceptance of her fate without fear and panic. No struggle or clinging to breath and tears, a single numbing blow to liberate me. Then let me drop and relax and melt into the huge ease of death. Part of therapy for PTSD can be grounding yourself in the present moment, accepting the symptoms and not fighting them, but reminding yourself of when and where you are. Here, Cassandra is calm, and she knows where she is. She knows what's going to happen, and she doesn't fight it. She realizes that the only way to escape her trauma is to accept the fate that has been laid out in front of her. My point of this talk has been less about diagnosing a character with any particular disorder. As I said earlier, it's just not possible. What I have been aiming to show is that the ancient texts we read are still relevant to our experiences in the modern world. We are often in danger of studying these texts like they're an artifact locked behind glass in a museum. something trapped in the past. These texts are still living, and our understanding evolves and changes with every rereading, along with our own life experiences. I enjoyed this tragedy even before my own experiences, but after my PTSD diagnosis, it opened up a whole new way of interpreting it. These stories and traditions are living things, part of a culture that still exists, that did not disappear as Greece passed out of the classical era. Thank you.
Next, we're going to hear from Yiannis Gabriel, who is the author of Greek Myths for a Post-Truth World. He is a sociologist best known for his contributions to the academic field of organizational storytelling. He earned his PhD in sociology in 1981 from the University of California, Berkeley, with a thesis entitled Freud and Society. And he is a professor emeritus at Bath School of Management, held chairs at Imperial and Royal Holloway University of London. And of course, he's going to speak about his book. Thank you so much, Yanni, for being here.
Thank you, Irene, and thank you for inviting me to this very, very exciting symposium. And already I feel that there is a tremendous discussion developing following Zoe's presentation. I'm really, really glad to be in the presence of so many people who are enthusiasts of Greek myths, and maybe what I have to say will reinforce some of your enthusiasms, even if at the end of my presentation I will sound one or two notes of caution. I'm going to talk about Greek myths and their relevance to the world we inhabit today and how they preserve their relevance, starting maybe with a rather simple story, a myth that captured my attention. Unlike many of the others that I discuss in my book, this is something that captured my attention relatively late in my life. It's a story which some of you may have heard, Erysichthon and Demeter. It has come to us from several sources, most notably from the Alexandria poet Callimachus and the Roman poet Ovid, both of them in verse. And the story essentially is the same in both. And try to picture the scene. It's a beautiful spring day in Thessaly, in Greece, a beautiful grove where flowers are growing, birds are twittering, butterflies everywhere, bees buzzing, a really peaceful and quiet landscape. It is in this landscape that a young man called Erysichthon arrives, accompanied by 15 or 20 of his mates. They are equipped with axes, and they look around the grove, and suddenly Erysichthon declares that this is a place where he can collect plenty of timber in order to build a banqueting hall in which he and his buddies can run riotous parties. The men look around, and Erysichthon is the first one to strike with his axe an almighty poplar tree. Just as the axe hits the tree, a deep groan is heard from deep inside the tree. Erysichthon pauses for a moment, looks around, and in the distance he sees a female apparition. He doesn't know it, but it is goddess Demeter, who's assumed the form of one of her priestesses, and approaches Erysichthon, speaking kindly to him and saying to him, "Young man, pride of your parents, don't strike this tree. Leave this peaceful grove alone, because it is sacred to Demeter and her priestesses." Erysichthon shoves the woman aside and says to her, "Mind your own business, woman," shaking his axe in her direction. Of course, he doesn't realize that this is Demeter, and Demeter's business is very much looking after the woods and the forest and landscapes. And although she's normally quite a kind and considerate and generous goddess, she takes it very badly. She decides to punish Erysichthon from his presumption, and the punishment that she casts on him is that he's seized by an insatiable appetite. He's very hungry, and he starts eating endlessly. And the more he eats, the hungrier he becomes. He eats and eats and eats, and his hunger consumes him. And then he starts selling all his possessions in order to buy more food, and eventually he ends up destitute. He has nothing more to sell, and he starts consuming his own body, eating his own flesh. So at the end, there is nothing left of him other than the story I've just told you. So this is a story, a myth indeed, which contains many different ideas, symbolisms. It can spark all kinds of discussions. It can be read in many different ways. And I'll just try very briefly to develop some of the themes that obviously it immediately strikes us as an allegory of the abuse of nature, and Demeter taking exception to what amounts to a violation of nature, a use of natural resources purely as a resource and not as something sacred, something that may embody larger and more permanent meanings. At the same time, trees themselves embody a very powerful symbolism. Trees as the source of life, as permanent features of our environment, as resting places for birds and a whole biological and landscape. Yes. And then, of course, the question of addictive consumption, the way that Erysichthon is seized by an endless appetite that cannot be satisfied, and he's consumed by his own hunger. Something that we, living in an age of eating disorders, can very easily and well relate to. So he's consumed by his rampant consumerism. So the eating disorder comes in there. And of course, we shouldn't forget that this is a deeply gendered story. We have a gang of hoodlums led by Erysichthon who enter a peaceful female space, one which is sacred to Demeter and her priestesses, one in which on nights with full moon they dance around the trees, and they violate the space. They brutally make their presence felt, and of course they then pay a price for it. So thinking about the tree, it is actually an embodiment of life, and Erysichthon violates the tree of life. But approaching this in this way maybe blinds us to another possibility. And here is where I think the story of Cassandra we heard of earlier is very instructive, because Cassandra can be a very powerful symbol of more than one underlying messages and themes. And in the same way, the tree of life in the story of Erysichthon and Demeter could very easily be seen as the tree of truth. What about if we think of Erysichthon and his hoodlums gradually seeking to demolish truth and replace it with a bunch of half-truths, bullshit, and conspiracy theories, and all kinds of nonsense, like the ones that we are confronted today in a world that is sometimes described as post-truth. Of course, the story could be seen metaphorically as an allegory of an assault on truth as much as an assault on nature and on life. So thinking mythologically, forces us, first of all, to spend a little bit of time reflecting on etymology. Etymology is never accidental in myths. It is a very important part. The very word Erysichthon, the name of the young prince, protagonist of our story, stands for Earth Terror, even though there are versions of the story in which he has a different name. And there are different versions. There are various differences in accounts of the story, and this is good and proper in Greek mythology, where there isn't really one definitive and final version. The very word myth comes from the Greek verb mio, which means shut tight, and it is the source of the words like mystery and mimesis, which in Greek means introduction to sacred rites and initiation ceremonies. Mystery, myelos, which is a soft material that is enclosed in hard bone, and miax, which is a Greek word for muscle. So just as a muscle is tight shut, likewise a myth is something that is a bit of a mystery. It's shut and it needs an effort, it needs an engagement to reveal its deeper meaning. So myth originally stood for authoritative spoken acts. It was part of initiation rites into mysteries, and gradually it evolved into signifying rich symbolic narratives, usually with a sacred dimension, and narratives with a plot. For me, plot are very important because without a plot, you sort of end up with a kind of simplified, iconic universe. Myths have got beginnings, middles, and ends, even if the end can be the beginning of a subsequent myth. In the case that we've just heard about Erysichthon, the plot is relatively simple: a presumptuous act by a foolish young man, followed by a warning, a disregard of the warning, and a retribution or punishment. But of course, the plots of myths are many and varied, and plots cannot be constructed by willy-nilly throwing incidents into a pot. They have to have a logic and a grammar of their own. Now, myths are very important in our lives because they help us make sense of very complex and confusing situations, inner and outer. I mean, how wonderfully Zoe explained how engaging with the myth of Cassandra enabled her to make sense of the inner torment and chaos that seized her following the onset of the PTSD disorder. Myths help us in extreme situations, and extreme situations are not as uncommon as we like to imagine them being. And in the course of our lives, we will all face several extreme situations which are not unlike those confronting the heroes of the classical myths. So they help us make sense, and they free our imagination from stultifying assumptions of our times. Look again how wonderfully the previous discussion following Zoe's presentation, suddenly all kinds of wonderful ideas started to surface as each and every one of us in this symposium started thinking beyond the constraints of everyday life. They educate our emotions, and they allow us to express our emotions, to empathize, but also to moderate some of our anxieties and temper our enthusiasms. In our times when constructing meaning has become so precarious and so difficult, when many of us confront endlessly a kind of black hole of meaninglessness, myths act as fountains of meaning, filling the potential vacuum of meaning, and at least help us engage with other humans of different cultures and different eras who very often confronted similar dilemmas, similar predicaments, similar tragedies like our own. Of course, myths also help us shape collective and individual identities. collective identities by embracing a similar myth, by becoming audiences of the same tragedy or the same comedy, but also individually by identifying with different heroes and heroines, by looking at ourselves as being made of in the same mold as some of them, help us build our identities and support them, sustain them in times of trouble and difficulty. Of course, they also have a moral dimension. Myths very clearly tell us, distinguish between good and bad, between what is permanent and what is temporary, but above all, they act as parts of a moral education of our emotions and our intellects. So it is for this reason that Aristotle has this magnificent quote: anyone captivated by the wonders of the world and acknowledging their own ignorance in the face of such mysteries is a true seeker of wisdom. This is why a lover of myth, philomythos, is also a lover of wisdom, philosophos, as myths too are full of wonders. So it is in this I mean, I think that can very clearly be seen as being written in opposition to his teacher Plato, who was a critic of myths and poetry. Aristotle seeks to defend myth as something that is a pursuit of truth in its deeper sense, and the lover of myth, in which he includes himself, is also a lover of wisdom. Now, very, very briefly, in my book, I take 10 different stories or myths that are very powerful and very personal. I have very, very personal response to them. They arouse very strong emotions. Most of them are myths that I learned when I was a very young child. And they're illustrated in my book by my sister, Mariana, who was also an interlocutor in my discussions and strivings to understand these myths. So the first one is a simple story of two painters in which one paints a magnificent painting of grapes, which attracts the attention of birds. Confident of his victory, he invites his rival to reveal what he has painted, which is concealed behind a veil. And his rival, of course, says, "Why don't you reveal? Don't you see what is hiding under the veil?" And immediately the younger painter realizes that the veil is indeed the painting and acknowledges the superiority of his older peer by saying, "I was only able to deceive the birds, you were able to deceive me, an artist." So who is deceiving whom? And I use this as a starting point to explore the concept of deception, the concept of what is truth in a story. I look at Iphigenia, a powerful, powerful story, that not Iphigenia in Aulis, which is a well-known and immense tragedy, but her maybe less well-known sister, Iphigenia in Tauris, where a tragedy by Euripides, where she escapes from the land of the barbarians, of the Taurians, and unexpectedly, when her brother Orestes arrives, who is pursued by the Furies, it's a magnificent account of a woman who takes control of her destiny and who somehow manages to escape from a life of slavery, but at the same time, the tragedy raises the question of our encounter with the barbarian other. Who is the barbarian, the other, or maybe something that we conceal within ourselves? The third story was one that my mother told me when I was a 5-year-old child, or maybe even younger, about Phaethon, the young boy who longed to fly and who asked his father Helios to lend him his chariot of the sun so that he could ride it across the sky. Reluctantly, Helios acquiesced, but as you may know, Phaethon lost control of the chariot, and Zeus caused immense damage on the earth, and Zeus eventually had to bring him crashing to the earth. It ended up in with tears for everybody. Oedipus and Thebes, of course, this is a story that has deeply, deeply moved me and continues to move me really to this day. And I link it very strongly with the idea of miasma, of a deep state of putrefaction, and spiritual as well as material disease and contagion, and the call for cleansing, which very often leads to scapegoats and to intensification of miasma. Miasma is not just toxicity. Miasma is something that cannot be metabolized or shaken off, but something where the quest for solutions very often brings about a worsening of the situation. I'm aware that I don't want to overrun the time allocated to me, so I'm going to jump the next ones, which are maybe different. Odysseus and Nausicaa, Narcissus and Echo, the Trojan War, Odysseus and the Sirens. Incidentally, Odysseus and the Sirens is a really beautiful story. Very, very short extract from the Odyssey, told in 2 sections. And many people know it, but not maybe so many people know Kafka's paraphrase of that particular story, which is an absolute work of genius. Kafka imagines Ulysses, as he calls him, sailing past the Sirens in a zen-like cocoon, instead of having himself tied to the mast and blocking the ears of his colleagues. In Kafka's account, Ulysses is totally oblivious to the Sirens and passes the rock completely oblivious, while the Sirens become more and more agitated, and gradually they seem to fall in love with him. Is it noise or is it silence that is the threatening aspect of the Sirens? This is a question that Kafka's story probes us to explore. So these are the 9 core starting points of mythological thinking in my book. And before now I conclude, I just want to say, for people like ourselves who really love myths, we have to be careful, because it is possible to idealize myths. Myths are great, as I said, in creating meaning and establishing identity and educating our emotions and so forth. But in the hands of skillful propagandists, myths can also become dangerous tools. They can unleash hatred and hostility. They can unleash feelings of superiority against other people, which can be extremely destructive. Myths have undoubtedly a dark side, and I think that it was this that frightened Plato. Although they can inspire empathy for our fellow humans, they can also inspire hate and contempt for others who we regard, or who in the myth are cast as subhuman or barbarian or simply other. Terrorism can seek justification in old myths that have hardened into dogma, old myths that have to be defended and which inspire acts of abject violence. And then, of course, there are all kinds of pseudo-myths cooked for different occasions to support projects of violence and even extermination and genocide. So myth can then sort of disintegrate into nothing more than a kind of popular untruth, like 6 myths about slimming or 10 myths about vaccination or whatever. And this really completely diminishes the idea of a myth and banalizes it. So I would argue, and this is what my book aims towards, a reconciliation of mythos and logos. Mythos being, of course, the daughter of Dionysus, and logos being the product of Apollo, different gods in the Greek pantheon. A reconciliation of mythos and logos. We don't idealize myths. We recognize that they have limitations. After all, they were products of a heroic age of heroes and epic struggles, and there are many important issues that are left outside myths. We need to submit myths to critical scrutiny and stop them turning into dogma or ideology. Bear in mind seriously Plato's criticism of myths, that, to quote, if you admit the muse of poetry in your republic, instead of law and reason, you end up with pleasure and pain as the rulers of the republic. Plato was both seduced. He loved, of course, Homer, and yet in his Republic, he decides to keep Homer and all the other poets banned from the city because they stir up passions, because they portray gods in unglamorous ways, and so forth. So my arguments would be that we need logos as well as mythos to flourish as human beings, to maintain rich and fluid identities, to recognize the limitations of our power, to create meaningful relations with those around us, and to begin to understand some of the complexities of the world in which we live. So thank you very much.
For now, we're going to move on to Laura Jenkinson-Brown, who has recently published a brilliant choose your own adventure novels. I don't know how many of you were fans of those when you were young, but wonderful concept. And Laura has taught classical civilization and introductory Latin for nearly 20 years, focusing on KS 3 to 4 classics and A-level literature, and ancient history A-level for 7 years. She has also taught English literature, history, and drama. You might know Laura from her popular Greek myth comics, which illustrate the ancient world in stick figure style, and of course her recent book that I mentioned, You Are Odysseus, an interactive retelling of the Odyssey. And today Laura is going to talk about the conception of the book.
Thank you so much, Irene. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Did I remember to unmute? Well, it's so lovely to be invited to talk to you all about this. It feels very self-indulgent, actually. I last came and talked in Belfast, I think in about 2018 maybe, which was wonderful. And I got to meet Helen, who sadly isn't here, and it's been lovely to keep in touch. As Irene introduced me, I'm a teacher, and I teach secondary classical civilization. I'm originally an English teacher, though, and I'm a massive myth nerd and story nerd. So I just thought, rather than animate, I'll just leave everything on screen in case people want to read ahead, but I won't read too much. But the whole idea for this book came out of teaching, and everything I do seems to be trying to center teaching as the focus and try and introduce more people to the myths, or at least get a better understanding of them, especially when they've maybe only heard snippets. And particularly, I was teaching the GCSE Classical Civilization Homeric World topic, and that covers Mycenaean Greece on one hand, and then the literature is Homer. So it sort of ties one to the other enough. I mean, we don't know exactly, if Homer is really talking about that period, but it is a really nice way of looking at both of those things together and seeing similarities. And I've made comics of all of the chapters of the Odyssey that we study, because that's a really nice way of getting the kids to be able to remember them visually. We have a lot of dual coding. There's a lot of visual representations of the characters and the literary devices and the action, so that they can remember it better, because then they get tested on it. But really, they need to have a bit more of an understanding of what happens in the rest of the Odyssey. But there's only ever 5 books on the syllabus. And they often lack the time or the dedication or, frankly, the ability to sit down and read it. Although that is, thankfully, coming back in spades. So we focus at GCSE on the themes of xenia and kudos, kleos, and nostos, so hospitality and reputation and homecoming, as well as the character of Odysseus himself. And knowing other examples from the rest of the text of these are really important, and they kind of help understand the character of Odysseus more, which is often kind of difficult to get from just the specific books that are on the syllabus. So, for example, currently it's books 9, 10, 19, 21, and 22. So it lands you immediately in his storytelling without any prequel. And then it lands you in Ithaca, and you've only read a bit of the narrative and a bit of what happens when he gets back. And often students have other background information. So they have other sources. So, for example, Wikipedia, immediately. That's the first thing they go to. They've read Percy Jackson, which I think has been around for as long as I've been teaching. They've read Stephen Fry's trilogy, which was very interesting. His version of the Odyssey left out so much. And maybe other classics podcasts and other sources as well. So they've got their own ideas about what Odysseus is. Oh, Epic the Musical, of course, which is a hugely important at the moment in getting people interested in the Odyssey. And then they can't necessarily fit what they know into what is actually in the Odyssey. So, for example, with Epic the Musical, to use that, it's a very different character and a very different character arc. And it also leaves out quite a lot that's in the Odyssey. So on top of that, some people just flat out hate Odysseus. Oh, he did this crime and he did that, so we must immediately separate ourselves from him, and we're not allowed to like him. And so the idea that maybe we have to put ourselves in his shoes and understand why he makes often awful and terrible decisions, not to justify them, but to sort of see the reasoning behind them, and also put us into that ancient frame of mind that is something that we just don't have. So how it then got started is my husband made a throwaway comment and said, wouldn't it be cool if you did a Choose Your Own Adventure of the Odyssey? I went, oh, yes. And I started writing it. And we were meant to be going to a wedding that afternoon. So I was a bit distracted. But I immediately had a go, and just to see if, he's constantly making these choices in the story. Could you rewrite that, or did it have to be something else? And I think with every good bit of classical reception, it needs to be a companion piece. It needs to be a different what's the word? It needs to be a different interpretation, or it needs to do something new with it. You can't just rewrite the myth over and over. Every ancient rewriter of myths did the same thing. It can't be a replica. It can't be a replacement either. It's got to sit with it. So I thought this might be a really fun way of having something that sits with the Odyssey that is then also, as teacher mode, the perfect vehicle for sort of stealth teaching additional material. So you've got other mythology, comparative mythology and contemporary mythology, and also other ancient texts and other ancient history and material culture. So especially when I was teaching this particular topic, linking in Mycenaean cultural details and material culture to the Odyssey was quite interesting. And also, this is a great opportunity, I thought, to try and enhance the background voices from the text. The crew, who are hardly ever named. The slave women, who are presumably in the hold, because we never ever hear from them. And maybe some of the other characters who don't really get much of a voice. So my overall conceit was, in many of the key moments of Odysseus' narrative and his campaign in Ithaca, the formulaic phrases, he communed with his great mind, to use one popular translation, or his thoughts turned this way and that. They tell us that he is considering more than one course of action. That's his particular characteristic. He is clever, but he's also wily. So he's thinking things through. It's not always the best course of action, but it's the right one for that moment, according to him. And so sometimes there is an obvious alternative that is supplied by the text. Do you, for example, go and find shelter, or do you catch pneumonia next to the beach when you wash up on the shores of Scheria? And sometimes there isn't, though. So could these alternate stories be used to highlight or contrast with what actually happens in the Odyssey? And can the blanks, as it were, explore another alternate choice and lead you to discover why he made the choice that he did. Sometimes the choices are very similar, and in the book they are similar, but they are slightly different enough that you would almost feel like you were having deja vu should you read it more than once. The resulting pathways read almost identically, except for some critical details. And this way you can have very different and difficult experiences each time you approach the text. So, challenges of doing something with this. I wondered, first of all, because the structure of the Odyssey is so important, could this be done in the same structure as the Odyssey? And actually, originally, I wanted to do Odysseus and Telemachus and Penelope as 3 different storylines and separate character voices with their own adventures. So you got to explore them. But then Odysseus is one turned into, the final book is 720 something pages and about 200,000 words. So I might come back to those other ones later. And I thought it possibly could be done in the same order, in that you are starting the text in book 5, you're on a beach, you do flashbacks. But then I thought that actually takes away the agency of the character if you've already made decisions and you've ended up on Calypso's island. So it made more sense to do what actually most modern retellings in fiction and media do, which is go chronologically, go back to Troy for context, and the horse, which even isn't really in Homer except for that brief mention in book 4 of the Odyssey, where it's talked about by Menelaus. And it makes sense as well, because a modern audience is not necessarily going to have the same context as an ancient audience. So it does make sense to put that in. So I started there. And then originally my first draft, you could get home in 3 sections because you just went. It was really unsatisfactory. It was kind of fun to prove that he could have just made one decision differently and go home. But that wasn't much fun to read. It's fine as a little classroom exercise, but I had tasted blood at this point. I wanted something to be more interesting. So I added a bit of information about the trouble between Agamemnon and Menelaus in the aftermath of the sack of Troy, which is told by Nestor in book 3. And then I thought, well, who is Odysseus anyway? People, as I said before, they love him or they hate him, and often they find it difficult to reconcile those 2 feelings. So I added a sort of choice gate, a section in the early area where it gets you thinking about, as the reader, what choices you're going to impose on this version of Odysseus that you are creating. Are you going to do it by the book, literally, by the Odyssey, and choose what you want? You can do that. But this choice gate asks you to decide, did you try and kill Diomedes for the Palladian? Because rather than, are you going to go home or are you not? This gets you thinking about what his character is like. And you play Odysseus as the kind of man you think he is, and you try and focus your decisions a bit more. And ultimately, that story is very divisive, and it's very late. I think it's mostly Augustan. But it does allow the reader to realise that Odysseus is much more complicated than just he's all right or he's not. So this is just an example of what it sort of looked like when I got about halfway through. It's now so big I can't export this from the program I was using to write it. But you can see that there are some really linear choices, and then the others sort of drip off, and there's most of the time maybe 2 or 3 choices you can make, which lead you into very specific areas. Bit of a close-up of one, and loops and going back on yourself. So you can make specific choices. And then over here, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, you can see that all roads lead to this point, and go back on yourself. So it does give the reader a chance to maybe reconsider the choices that they made earlier on in the text, to encourage them to get a bit further than just going home. So I then tested it on some of my friends and some of my pupils. So I asked someone who's really, really familiar with the Odyssey, Dr. Corbeth Fraser, who I worked with on Asterion. And she said, this is so much fun. And she's trying to make the same choices that Odysseus makes, but they're just so stupid. She can't bring herself to do it. So she keeps getting safely home, which is fascinating, because actually when I tried this on later with later readers, when it's finished, they did the same thing. But also she found really interesting the way that I'd kept in all of my beloved narrative devices and choices to make it sound a bit like Homer at least. I also asked some of my friends who are sort of, what's the word, public historians. So Erica, who runs Moan Inc., you might be familiar with, and Liv, who runs Let's Talk About Myths Baby, the podcast, both of whom are also fascinated by the Odyssey and are actually writing books on it themselves. And they had very similar experiences. They tried to play it through to see what would happen, and they both kind of appreciated it. It would be a really fun way of introducing people to the Odyssey. And then I asked my class to play it. I have several classes I had at the time, this is going back a few years now, who play D&D with me on a Thursday, because I obviously have this background. You don't necessarily launch yourself into choose your own adventures without having grown up with them and D&D and that kind of thing. So my GCSE class at the time, who hadn't read the Odyssey yet, they were trying to make the decisions as a group from what they thought they knew of the Odyssey and what they thought would be the right thing to do, because they hadn't actually met Odysseus yet. And they died pretty quickly. And they only made one of the same choices as Odysseus and made it as far as Aeolus. But then they told the men about the content of the winds, which you would think would be a good choice. But then they lost their crew's focus by abandoning people on the island of the Lotus Eaters. So that was quite interesting. My sixth form role-play game players had studied only those chapters of the Odyssey, and some of them had read around it. So they were a bit lost at first because they didn't know what choices he would have made leading up to Calypso and so forth. And then they fell into the right choices, what they thought the right choices, by the time they got to the narrative books, which they managed to do. And they discussed loads of things, but then they didn't do the most D&D thing, which was sack the coconas and get the super strength wine from Maron, son of Euanthes, which is this great problem. You have to have it in order to survive the Cyclops. And then my ancient historians who had done classics, they decided to play it where they would keep a tally of how many men Odysseus had killed. And I think at that point I realized I really needed to emphasize more that it's not just the men on his ships who are there. You know, there are countless slaves who are in their ships too. And they killed 78 men plus Odysseus, but no enslaved women. And they thought that was a great win, frankly, in their 45-minute chunk. And they were really pleased with the other myths they didn't know before that this had opened up to them and linked them to it. So this is how we were playing it, making a list so we could pick out some details, and then just in case they didn't quite like their choices, we could go back and redo it. But I tried to make notes of what they were thinking of at the time and what their discussion was, and where, say, in this one, Felix and Mark both wanted to do slightly different things. So they had to remember what they would bring as a guest gift to Polyphemus in order to justify their choices and what happened later on. So it really got them thinking about the text in a really interesting way. Then I took it to the Classical Association conference in 2022, and I talked about it as an educational tool. But so many people said that they wanted to read it. I thought, well, I better finish it then, because I was only halfway through it at this point. So I thought, well, how can I develop this further? What potential for further stories are there from the Odyssey itself? So if we use the Phaeacians as an example, on really close reading, they only give Odysseus aid to return home because they've been impressed by him, by his entrance, where he appears out of nowhere, grabbing Arete by the knees, and the fact that Nausicaa can vouch for him and behaving in the right way towards her. And then he tells them a really amazing story. They all donate goods to him, his good cause, and then ship him home. So what if they didn't get impressed by him? What if he was found naked on a shore, suffering from having exposure from staying outside all night? Did he make Nausicaa feel uncomfortable? What happened there? So that was a fun sidetrack. Calypso, that's interesting because he glosses over that. Yes, I stayed for 7 years. I was stuck there. She offered me immortality and agelessness. So I had quite a lot of fun imagining what that relationship might have been like, but also giving readers the option to see what happens if he does accept immortality and agelessness. Can she even offer this in her rather lowly position as the kind of goddess that she is? And then there's his personality himself. He didn't really want to go to Troy, it seems, in the earlier stories. But then he seems to be very kudos or kleos focused in the Odyssey. He makes all these silly choices, perhaps we would say, elongating his journey in order to see what he can get out of the people that they might meet. So, has he become someone else, or could he go backwards? Menelaus' journey home, one summer I thought, what if he went with Menelaus? And then I got to spend my entire summer break researching ancient Egypt, which is great because I've always wanted to go there in my head. What if Odysseus had third wheeled with him, with Menelaus and Helen for the last 7 years? And so that was really exciting and interesting to play with. And then I thought, well, I've played with that, and that was sort of comical. What about the potential for tragedy? The story in books 13 to 24 is very much he arrives just in time. Penelope is just about to make a decision. She's just about to do her trick with the bows and arrows. Telemachus, well, because mentor Athene has pushed him towards it. He's just started acting like a man. He's ready to meet his father. What if he missed that window? What would they have done without him? Would they have survived? And what if the story turned into a tragedy instead? So I have, in fact, written a 3-page tragedy in the style of Euripides, which you find in the text as a bit of an Easter egg, which I know, spoiler, it's a tragedy. It didn't end well. So people often ask me what my research was. I started off by making a huge spreadsheet of literally every time Odysseus is mentioned in every myth you can find. And then I also, as I was writing, I kept my notes, and I ended up with a 33-page note document of ancient Mediterranean history and research and mythology rabbit holes, which I've since published on my website as a sort of author's note. If you want to know why I made these decisions, there they are. And then finally, I gave it to some people to have a read of, to see what they thought. And I was just so overwhelmed by all the positive reception and people saying overall it's a fun way to revisit the Odyssey. I was surprised at how many details I'd forgotten. It made me rethink some of my reactions to Odysseus' choice. It's there. That was my ideal reaction from someone reading it, especially if they had read the Odyssey before. Some people hadn't or weren't particularly familiar with it, and they also said that they now wanted to read the Odyssey as with this as a companion to it. And lots of them just really loved the concept of a choose your own adventure style text. I can't say it is a choose your own adventure because they're very litigious, and that was really exciting too. And finally, I was able to publish it, and some of my new author friends as well had also written really, really very lovely reviews about how satisfying it is often to just try not to be Odysseus or to see who Odysseus really is. So I've rather rattled through that, but my overall conclusions were, while it is by no means a conclusive new version of the Odyssey, and that would never be what I would try to do, the overall consensus is that it is an extremely fun and very accessible way of experiencing the Odyssey that has the ability to intrigue readers into reading the real Odyssey and test their memory of it. Introduce them to the language, argue about the characters' choices in a way that is in the spirit, I believe, of the original poem. And so far, 750 people have chosen to purchase a copy, which is amazing. So it's just wonderful to know that it's out there and people are enjoying it and reading it and telling me about it and having this sort of feedback. So if you're interested in having a go yourself, if you go to my website, I put up a little trial test yourself out version that plays on screen of the first few chapters if you want to try before you buy, for example. But overall, it's just been the most wonderful experience and got me to understand the Odyssey better as well, which I didn't expect and was just wonderful because, frankly, just learning new things all the time is why I became a teacher, I think, and then introducing them to others. So thank you so much for allowing me to introduce it to you.
And so Dr. Evelien Bracke is an award-winning scholar of classical mythology and education. Through her research and public engagement, she's committed to widening access to the study of antiquity and demonstrating the enduring impact of ancient stories on modern life. Her talk is based on her second book, The Meaning of Myth in Uncertain Times, How Classical Mythology Helps Us Navigate a Time of Crisis. Today, Evelien will give us a talk entitled A Body of Pure Potential, the Octopus as Homeric Hero. I think you might be muted.
Yes, thank you, Rini. I hope this works. The screen is shared now. Fantastic. Hi, everybody. Wow, what a wonderful symposium Helen has organized. Such beautiful personal approaches. Um, I'm going to continue Laura's chat on the Odyssey, and I'm actually going to go back to book 5 as well. So today I want to talk to you about the octopus. I became fascinated with the octopus when I was a PhD student, and I found out that the Greeks actually saw octopuses as creatures of cunning. And so that's what I want to talk about today, give a short introduction about this. But it's also about my own environmental concerns, and so we'll talk about them more towards the end. Just a short, right. Um, Summary of why I'm giving this talk. So it's one of the chapters from a book of mine that has literally just come out last week. I've actually not received my own copies yet. So there is now a Dutch version of the book. I'm from Belgium originally, and so the English version, The Meaning of Myth in Uncertain Times, is an extended one, and that's where the octopus can be found. It is not a self-help book. It is a study of how classical myth is entwined in the stories that we now tell about our world and about the future that we're heading towards. So the book talks about the issues we're facing. For example, I talk about climate breakdown because a lot of environmentalists are using the Minotaur to symbolize sort of the unknowable Earth. I talk about the rise of authoritarianism in the context of masculinity in the Iliad. I talk about technology and AI because a lot of tech companies are using mythological figures such as Talos, the bronze giant, and Prometheus to tell the story of why they are amazing and why technology and its acceleration are amazing. I talk about the dubious role of social media in the whole process. I talk about the memes about Sisyphus. And so I also talk about the octopus. Um, there's an American professor in the history of science, Donna Haraway. Her books are amazing, and she argues. I have a reference list at the end of the talk. She argues that it matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. I love that quote, and this is what my book is about. So how we tell stories about the crises that we are now being faced with, and how we use myth to explain what's going on, to symbolize these crises, and to give authority to certain views. So let me just go into the final chapter of the book then, or at least part of it, about the way the octopus is represented as a hero in Greek epic as well as in modern popular culture, and what that can tell us about our own entwined relationship with our natural environment. But to find the octopus, we have to get back to Odysseus. Odysseus is on his way home, and in book 5 of the Odyssey, we find him at sea. So, just to give you the context, he has lost all of his ships and his men before he got onto Calypso's island. He was stuck there for 7 years, as Laura already discussed. And then, when he's finally allowed to leave Calypso's island, he can only make a raft, a small raft. But the problem is then the god Poseidon sees him leaving the island of Calypso, and he then wrecks the raft. And this is a passage in the Odyssey that I just want to focus on for the next 10 minutes. Because Poseidon creates a huge storm that destroys the raft, and so Odysseus is just afloat at sea, clinging on to one tiny wooden plank, and then he spots land, the land of the Phaeacians, where he will find safe haven, right? But he doesn't know that yet when he is at sea. He's terrified. He's at his wit's end. He becomes terrified of the crags and of the rocks looming ahead at the land, and he almost gives up at sea, almost drowns. He's worried that storm winds will come or that sea monsters will kill him. So it's a really disastrous moment in Odysseus's journey. It's eventually the goddess Athena who encourages Odysseus to continue and to swim towards the shore. And this is the passage I want to focus on because Athena suggests that he grabs hold with both hands of a big rock that's at the shore, and then the waves will crash over him. Now, the problem is it doesn't actually work. He holds on to the rocks, but the waves are so strong that they pull him back into the sea. Eventually, he will make it to land, but this is a very difficult moment. And so, in order to explain what happens as Odysseus is clinging on to the rock and then being swept back to sea, Homer actually uses a fairly unlikely comparison. So, the word that we will use for Homeric comparison is a simile. And so this is on the PowerPoint here, as when an octopus, dragged from its den, has many pebbles sticking to its suckers, so Odysseus' strong hands were skinned against the rocks. What an amazing simile is this? So octopuses belong to the cephalopod family of marine animals. So the cephalopods is at the top of the PowerPoint there. So literally the head-footed, because the Greeks, or rather not the Greeks, but it's as if their head is directly stuck to their legs. The species includes squid with 10 tentacles, octopuses with 8 tentacles, and cuttlefish with 8 arms and 2 tentacles. And so this is the comparison here. Homer compares the force of the waves dragging Odysseus from the rock to some kind of unknown force dragging an octopus from its den, from its home. Now, for anyone who's read any part of the Odyssey, you'll have come across similes or comparisons like these, right? So the experiences of the Homeric heroes are compared with experiences from our natural environment. But Homeric similes are rarely straightforward, and so I just want to focus on what's actually going on here because there's so much going on. So Odysseus' skin is torn from his hands, just as rock pebbles cling to the suckers of the octopus. So it's a bit of a bizarre comparison because Odysseus' skin is left on the rocks, but rocks are left on the octopus's skin. So the image reverses itself. I hope everyone's following with that. And it kind of blurs the victim and its environment, right? It gives us amazing insight in Odysseus' heroism because he's compared here not with a huge sea monster, but with a tiny creature trying to stay alive in hostile circumstances. Okay, let's go one level further because there is more to it. So first of all, that the octopus is dragged from its home while Odysseus is still on his way home obviously emphasizes the hero's vulnerability at this point. It also reverses Odysseus's role as a hero, right? He was once the predator of the Trojans. He displaced the Trojans from their homes. He defeated the Cyclops. He defeated Circe. Circe's in the image there, by the way. She's the woman on the left being chased by Odysseus there. But Odysseus now finds himself in the unlikely position of prey. And secondly, then, we see an octopus being dragged from its den. So there is an unknown attacker of the octopus. Maybe it's a shark, but more likely it's a human. And so that kind of tells us about Odysseus' fear of unseen threats ahead. I find this a moving simile. The emotions the victim feels, the panic at being captured and killed are the same for Odysseus and the octopus, for a human and marine life. The heroic world and the everyday merge here in the pain of displacement and that banal sort of momentary notion at which a life may be ended. So, fair enough, it seems that the octopus simile is added here to reveal Odysseus' vulnerability at a low point when he really just thinks he has to give up all hope. But there is more going on, and this is where, of course, all of the amazing features of the octopus become visible, because cephalopods are not necessarily victims. People in antiquity were fascinated by them, and so they actually thought that cephalopods were endowed with cunning intelligence, and the word for that in Greek is metis. And that's similar to Odysseus because people in antiquity also thought Odysseus had cunning intelligence. So I want to move on from Homer for a minute and have a look at another epic poem. So this is an epic poem, but about fish, which is written much later in Turkey in the 2nd century by a poet called Oppian. Oppian celebrates the shrewdness of cephalopods. And so he discusses the cuttlefish particularly, and that's the quote there on the PowerPoint. Cuttlefish are shrewd by nature. They have in their heads a dark, thick fluid, blacker than soot. It is a mysterious drug which creates a watery cloud. This is their natural protection against destruction. When fear seizes them, they immediately release dark drops of it. The cloudy fluid discolors and obscures all around the paths of the sea and blurs the sight. And so cuttlefish quickly escape through the dark waters, both from men and stronger fish. So obviously this refers to the octopus spraying ink. And so Oppian portrays marine life as mythological actors, just like the heroes of old. But cephalopods are particularly described as cunning heroes through their behavior, which makes them invisible to their predators and then seem less dangerous to their prey. There are loads more texts about cunning cephalopods in Greek literature. I just want to give two very quick examples. There's the Roman author Aeschylus from the 2nd, 3rd century, who tells us that octopuses ambush fish in the following way. They sit under the rocks and change their color to match, and so they appear to be indistinguishable from the rocks. The fish then swim towards the octopuses as if they were the rocks and are caught off their guard. The octopuses entangle them in their own form of net, their tentacles. So this is about another octopus skill, the fact that their skin cells can change color and texture to adapt to their environment. And so when we look at Oppian and Aeschylus together, we see the suggestion that the octopus is a shapeshifter with an unknowable identity, a cunning hero, really like Odysseus. So let's think back now of Homer's simile, where Odysseus clinging onto the rock is compared to an octopus. It's not just about highlighting Odysseus's pain and fear. It also asks us to question that whether what we're seeing is correct. Are they really pebbles clinging to the octopus, or are we being duped, and are they part of the octopus shifting his disguise, showing that he's getting ready for his escape? Where does the octopus end and the rock begin? It was a question that the Greeks constantly asked themselves. Are we seeing a predator or a prey? So the comparison with the octopus highlights Odysseus's unending reserves of cleverness, even when he himself thinks that he's about to give up. And in fact, it's immediately after he's compared to the octopus that he finds a way in, that he finds how he can actually get to the Phaeacians. So for the Greeks, I'm going to skip one part, but for the Greeks, so the octopus was all about shifting reality, right? You can never know what he is exactly. He blurs the clear boundaries of the material world between animal and then human and then the mineral. The octopus can look like a rock, and he's compared to Odysseus. But of course, there's a problem, because if cephalopods are so clever and cunning, the Greeks and the Romans thought that humans have to be more cunning than them in order to catch them. And for this, Oppian again gives one particular tactic. This is quite a funny text. And it's beautiful. For cuttlefish, hardworking fishermen do not set a deadly trap or enclosing net, but merely throw a single female cuttlefish into the sea attached to a line. The cuttlefish, when they see her from a distance, and I presume we can see, this is about the male cuttlefish, quickly rush towards her. They wrap themselves around her and cling to her with their arms, as girls cling to their brother or dear father, whom after many days they see returning safely home from a foreign land. In the same way, the clever cuttlefish wrap themselves around each other, and their passion does not end until the fishermen pull them onto the boat, and still they cling and die in their desire. It's a hilarious passage in some way, right? There's such an obvious misogyny, because to catch a cuttlefish, you need a cuttlefish, but then a female one. So how on earth did they catch the female cuttlefish? There's some kind of gender bizarreness going on there. So catching the male cuttlefish is the ultimate goal of the fisherman. That's the way he can show his superior masculinity and become like Odysseus, overcoming the Trojans with his cleverness. But for Oppian, the cuttlefish is also very human. He's a romantic and a passionate soul. This is a tragic passage. The poet compares the male octopus finding a female to a girl waiting at home for her male relatives to return. Just like Odysseus had been compared to an octopus when he was in dire straits, Oppian compares the male octopus to a girl, and so humanizes the animal. It's hard not to think of Odysseus here, right? Coming home, or rather Penelope waiting for her husband. There's a tragic reversal here of gender expectations. The male octopus feels safe in the arms of the female, but it is a trap. And it's ironic that the octopus's homecoming will be in a human stomach. So that's kind of my representation of the octopus in Greek literature. So it's heroized, really, and specifically seen as Odysseus and Penelope in the way they have this cunning intelligence. I very briefly want to give a few examples from our own fascination with cephalopods, because they are truly amazing creatures, and we are today, again, massively fascinated by them. So there's a beautiful book called Other Minds by Peter Godfrey-Smith, in which he argues that octopuses are the closest thing to alien intelligence on Earth. They have a pair of eyes, short and long-term memory, they recognize individual humans, they sleep, so they feel like they are similar to us. They're intelligent and curious, they use tools, solve games, overcome complicated obstacles. They're known for their playful behavior, yet they're also vastly unrecognizable. They're the only invertebrates, octopuses are, to have 9 brains, 1 central and 1 at the base of each arm, 3 hearts and 8 regrowable arms, with a total of 2,000 suckers. They have specialized skin cells, extendable skin patches that let them change color and texture to match their surroundings. And so Godfrey-Smith describes the octopus as having a body of pure possibility. The potential was my error there. It's a body of pure possibility. So I don't know if you remember Inky the octopus, who escaped from an aquarium in New Zealand in 2016. His daring escape made international news because he was seen as this hero slipping through the nets of human control. Maps with escape routes were actually shared internationally online, and the lab had to stress that Inky was really not unhappy at their facility, just adventurous. And it's bizarre that there have been children's books based on Inky's adventures since then, even though, by the way, unfortunately, they couldn't actually track Inky anymore after he escaped. And then there's the Netflix documentary, My Octopus Teacher, about this unusual bond between a filmmaker and a wild octopus. This actually sparked international debate about the relationship between humans and animals. Can we call this a real bond? Should people be allowed to form friendships with these animals if they then abandon them to their fate when they're attacked by predators? So this documentary had huge real-world impact. There was widespread ethical opposition to, for example, Spain's first octopus farm. Scientists have argued that creatures so demonstrably intelligent as octopuses suffer profoundly in confinement, and so there's huge continued debates about whether it's morally right that we should keep eating them. Yet even as our public admiration grows, industrial interests press on because the global consumption of octopus actually surges still. And so we have a paradox in our minds and on our plates. We idolize the octopus on the one hand in our popular culture, while engineering or at least condoning its mistreatment. And we already see this romanticized image of the octopus in antiquity. Not only in literature, where he's represented as a hero, as we've seen already, but he's also romanticized on fish plates, like the one here. I mean, isn't this octopus just the most amazingly cute one? So these were plates for eating fish, and we have the fish represented on them in a charming and idealized, romanticized way. And so this reflects a more general dichotomy among humans, and that's on the PowerPoint there, between ecological respect for other species, and then the pragmatism that regards nature as a human resource. So to come back to Odysseus, he's there at his weakest point compared to a small and vulnerable octopus. It's a beautiful image that exposes really the limitations of heroism and shows resilience in times of crisis. We have Odysseus's comparison with the octopus in the Odyssey, and we have the cuttlefish being compared with a young girl in Opian. And so humans and cephalopods seem to be intertwined in each other's lives. Donna Haraway describes this idea with the term becoming with, which acknowledges that species are continually shaping each other through their interactions and relationships. But most of all, the Greek literature seems to reveal a tension between the fact that we heroize the octopus on the one hand, while we treat it differently, right? There's between how we imagine the octopus and how we act towards it. It seems to be more about the values that we project onto the octopus than about the real octopuses as well. So we may be debating to what extent octopuses are sentient, but in the meantime, rising sea temperatures are threatening to blind them. Water acidification disrupts their development. Overfishing and plastic pollution compromise their ecosystems. And so as their habitat becomes more precarious, the heroism of the octopus and its vulnerability that we already see in Greek literature takes on a new urgency. And that's where I'd like to end for today. Thank you.